So with the latest update that's rolling out to the different regions, about half the regions have been updated here in May so far, and the rest in June. One of the features we're adding in is the ability to generate documentation within SmartConnect for any integration that's been configured and set up. So the only steps the end user has to do is actually find the integration or integrations they want the documentation for, select them, and click process, and SmartConnect will take care of the rest. So to give you an idea of what that looks like, we'll step through and actually perform that for a few integrations we have in one of our systems. So this is an internal company I'm using in SmartConnect, so there's no critical data being shown. But if we go into the system menu, there's now going to be a documentation section once the update's been performed in your region. And in the documentation section, you can see we ran a couple of these through before today, one a couple weeks ago. But if I want to create a new set of documentation, I can just click that plus sign at the top there. We can go ahead and say, I'll just give it a name. We can decide whether or not you want to include the source columns or the source data in that documentation. It makes it a little bit longer to read, but that truly shows everything that's moving around, so I'm going to keep that included. And then we can add integrations, and we've got a limit on there right now for up to 20 integrations, anywhere between 1 to 20 you can put together in one set of documentation that we're generating. Now, these are all test integrations in here. I'm going to look for a couple specific ones that I want to work with. We're going to do a SQL to SQL. We're also going to go ahead and do there's one going to Shopify doing a create update, and then I can add a few other ones in here as well, just so we can kind of build that out. Now, as I select the integrations, they're all going to appear in here. If you don't like some of them you selected, we could remove one of these. So if I don't want the special characters one from this documentation set, I can drop that off. Once you're happy with the list, we can go ahead and click process documentation, and we're going to see very quickly that the status is going to change as that's running. So we'll load through, process each of them. Depending on how complex it is, might take more than a couple seconds, but in general, it happens fairly quickly. And we just generate a basic HTML page for each one of these that it's done. Now, I can open up these individually now, and it's going to open in a new tab for me here. So let's go ahead and open this up. If I can, I'm going to have to exit full screen, I believe, to go ahead and see that. Oh, there it is. All right, so if we open up one of the documentations we created, this was a SQL to SQL, was the description of the integration. That's the idea of it. But any integration that we export for documentation is going to include everything that's been set up inside of it. So that's where you're getting your data from, where you're sending it to, how you've mapped the individual fields, and then if you've built any additional columns on there. So this first one I opened up is pulling from SQL. So you can see it gives some of the general information. It doesn't show any critical data in the documentation, so any passwords, any secrets, any data that serves as an authentication to any system, that's excluded, but the rest of the general data is included in here. So we can see the type of source we're pulling from, our query we're actually running against the contacts, and then our target, in this case, we're going back to SQL. So we can see we're going to default database, we're going to a specific table on here. These are the fields we're working with. And then on the integration, we can actually see where we're sending it. So it's sending it to a contacts table. You can see the specifics around the naming of it. You can see the different options or groupings we've set up on that. And then finally, we can see our source columns and the target columns they've been mapped to as you run through the documentation. So in general, it's taking apart an integration you've built. Any settings, any field mappings, any additional work that you've done is going to be shown in this documentation that it generates. Now, if I leave full screen again for a moment, we'll go back. Let's open up the Shopify one. This would be another integration that I exported out as part of the documentation. You can see I'm going to skip ahead to the additional columns section on it. As in addition to the source columns and the destination field mapping, in this integration, we've built additional columns, so data translations or lookups or calculated fields. So you can see it shows you the type of additional column on here. It shows you what's included in it. So in this sense, it was a calculated script. So you can see the script we're actually running inside of here. We can see there was a constant value set for one of them. And then we've actually got lookup columns as well. So you can see these are REST lookups. You can see the criteria, the actual fields that are being returned, and so on. So once again, every part of the integration that's been built gets exported out. We can take a look at the destination mapping. And again, this is a little bit more involved than the last one because in addition to just source columns being mapped, we've actually got one of our additional columns we had set on here, and it's setting it to that lookup. So we can actually see where everything is being mapped to, what it's set, the field type, and if there's anything else that's been configured in there. So again, this documentation will work for any integration that you've got set up and you've got permission to inside of SmartConnect. Once you generate it, I opened up these individually after I generated that, but if I go back to the main documentation section, I can come in here later and say, oh, there's my documentation process 3, let's download that, and then we'll actually download it as a zip file. So you can open up that entire package of integration documentation later on. So this is helpful for a few reasons. One, if you're a consultant and you've built out this either as a partner or if you're an internal consultant within your team, can quickly document any integrations that you've built or changed and export that out to have as a reference. Or you could just keep it so, again, from a partner's perspective, if a customer is curious on what you provide for your integrations, you could list it out that way, or you could use this to share information between members of your team if you have multiple people working on the same project or the same integrations. Or if you want to check to see if integrations have changed since when they originally deployed and documented, you can run that again and see if there's any difference between the two when you're comparing the documentation files. Generally, especially if we did projects as like E1, we'd include a number of hours on documentation ranging anywhere between 4 to 8 hours just for documentation on the project. So again, if you look at how many essentially pages of details that generated in a couple seconds, that would normally take somebody, I don't know, half an hour to an hour's worth of time for each integration if you went through and actually wrote out all the specific fields. So every integration, I'd say 30 minutes to an hour worth of time saved for the documentation. So we've spent a bit of time on this. We expect to add more features to it in the future in terms of what you want to include or exclude out from the documentation set that it generates. But for now, we have it far enough along. We wanted to include it and let the rest of the community make use of what we've been using internally for a little bit on our projects.